All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for our final seminar of the 2024-2025 school year. We'll be offering 3 talks next fall. One of them will be the rescheduling of Dr. Joshua Grubbs, who was going to come last month, but there were some other circumstances that made us move away from that. So he's the person who studies gambling and sports betting, which is really timely here in Kansas because of a lot of our neighboring states are legalizing this. You can't really turn on any sporting event and not see sports betting. You can't hear it. It's all over the radio. So he's really excited to reschedule for the fall. And then we will have 2 other speakers that are to be determined. So just if you're not on our listservs already, reach out to me, or you can find our contact info on the CLC website. There's a web form you can fill out that'll go to our staff and they'll get you added to our listservs. But today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Tim Trull from the University of Missouri with us today. He's a distinguished professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Missouri and director of the Personality and Emotion Lab. A little bit of a backstory: I did my postdoc training at the University of Missouri, where we didn't really directly interact that much, but I interacted with a lot of Dr. Trull's graduate students and postdocs, and has a long history of doing really impressive work in the area of personality, as well as we were talking a bit about some of his work with borderline personality disorder. But he really has, as he said, sort of reinvented his career to focus on ambulatory assessment and ecological momentary assessment and other real-time data collection methods. So he's interested in understanding dynamic psychological processes in people's daily lives. So taking the research out of the lab into the natural environment, where we can understand things like context and how all of these things impact decisions about whether to consume alcohol and other behaviors or other things that we're interested in. And so he is really interested, again, in these contextual triggers associated with alcohol, cannabis, nicotine use, and the lived experiences with people with mood and anxiety disorders. And by taking this data collection into their environment, we're able to answer questions about the psychological mechanisms underlying these behaviors in a real-world context. I'm not going to list his very impressive publication record, but just note that he has sustained funding over many years from NIH that has led to impactful studies in the field. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Trull. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for inviting me here. Shockingly, I've never been to Lawrence, Kansas, even though I've been in Columbia since 1989. So I don't know what happened. It's not like a pit stop on the way to Colorado. It's kind of off the highway. So, but yeah, glad to be here, and it's been fun talking to people about kind of what they do here and also their interest in maybe these sorts of methods. As Michael mentioned, I've had several former lives. One of my former lives, I started out, I was a personality and personality disorder researcher. I was big into the 5-factor model and applying 5-factor model to psychopathology. But it was really when I started studying borderline personality disorder that I started to sort of question some of the methods that we use as psychologists to assess people, specifically about changes and instability in their life. And so the traditional way of dealing with that typically was asking people over the last week, do your moods change a great deal? I mean, that sounds reasonable, right? Well, if you look at kind of memory heuristics, then you realize some of the dangers in that, because people are going to remember kind of the primacy recency stuff, they kind of average and so forth. So it's not clear that you're getting, like the right kind of precise figure, number one. Number two, if things are changing a great deal, I'd want to know like when they change and what may influence those changes. And so I became aware from some of my nicotine researcher friends about this method called ecological momentary assessment, where essentially you are studying people in their daily lives. And for me, the important part was that we're actually asking several times throughout a day about mood states and other things in relatively short time frames, so that we can kind of minimize any sorts of memory biases for the most part. And then would be able to kind of piece that together and see, okay, you say your mood's changing, great. What does your day look like? Let's see what your moods were like. Not surprisingly, some of the traditional questionnaire measures were not really good at picking this stuff up. They didn't always agree with what we collected via this. So started with that, and then because, as I'll talk about, people with borderline personality disorder also tend to, or many, become addicted to substances, or at least use substances maybe in a maladaptive way. That got me into studying addictions, alcohol, cannabis. So I am not an addiction researcher. Maybe probably the first person that's come to talk to you that'll say I was not trained as an addiction researcher. But I found that this method, I think, can be used to study the different factors and influences on what leads people to use and maybe overuse substances. So anyway, that's start. Okay, just a few disclosures. The main thing is this, I won't even say the name because I helped develop it and I'm in a company, so I'm not even going to talk about that. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? First, as the title, implies, I'm going to tell you something about what dynamic processes are. I think we have a general sense of that, but it's probably good to review that. I use the term ambulatory assessment. It's a little broader than EMA, but the reason why I use it is because, at least in my view, it also incorporates sensor data. So it's not just self-report stuff that you do on a smartphone. Why do we want to study people in daily life? I probably don't have to convince you about that. And then give some examples of how this method can be used to describe different sorts of processes, predict relevant outcomes, if you will, things we're interested in, and also get at kind of mechanistic things about these like the idea is that if there's some kind of underlying process or mechanism that leads to problematic behavior, this may be a point of intervention. And then depending on how much time I have, I do talk a lot. So maybe not much time. Also talk about how we go about measuring context and environment. It's an incredibly neglected topic, at least in clinical psych. We all say like, yeah, environment, whatever, wave our hands, but what is environment? Yeah, what are we talking about there? And then maybe talk a little bit about stuff that's going to happen in the future. I don't know about NIH funding, so that is not one of the things I'll talk about. Okay, what's a dynamic process? Here's a nice little definition. Dynamic process is a sequence of thoughts, feelings, and behavior that plays out over time. Okay, that sounds good. So what does that mean? Well, important point, it plays out over time. And so traditionally, when we do assessment, we're doing a cross-sectional assessment. We're asking people to retrospect over a time period, but we're not really measuring the process over time. Also, this is essentially, and I would argue every theory about psychopathology or other stuff too, is really within individuals' problem. What? Yeah, because every person can serve as his or her own control. So let's say we have drinking days and we have non-drinking days. Within the same person, I can look and see if there are differences between sober days and drinking days. Traditionally, we do everything between person, cross-sectional, and we're just looking at rank ordering of individuals on some scales. But this really gets at what a process is and how important it may be. I don't know if anyone recognizes the SORC model. I'm very old, okay, but basically it's an old kind of behaviorist thing where when any kind of problematic behavior thing we're interested in, stimulus, organism, goes on in your head, response, consequences. So we have the reinforcement there. We got the cue reactivity, you got a lot of things. So I think this model can be really helpful to understand some of the stuff we'll talk about. And then finally, at least this implies that some of these things may be affected by context and the environment. All right, so this used to be a big shock to people, and coming from me as a personality researcher, trait personality researcher, guess what? Everything changes over time. I don't believe in traits. Traits are a convenient way of summing up a density of behaviors. And even things like personality, as I'll show you, is now people are finally talking about states of personality instead of traits of personality. The same is true for all forms of psychopathology as well. So these changes occur within people and over time. This is a classic, at least in my view, classic study from Gleason a long time ago. But the idea here was to see if trait-like measures of personality could account for more variance than state-like measures of personality, if you will. And so what he did is he did a couple of studies, 5 times a day, people were prompted and they were asked about behaviors and affects that were relevant to the 5-factor model of personality, this cutoff, extroversion, agreeableness, so on. And what they found in this chart is that there was more within person variation than between person variation, whether they just aggregated across the states or had people fill out questionnaires. So to me, at least, here's something that kind of personality, it's trait-like. Everyone, yeah, there's a little variation, but in general, they actually are demonstrating that people that are responding based on their endorsements of certain behaviors and feelings that are relevant to these traits, that you see more variation within an individual than across people. A simpler example. How many drinks you have every day? How many days you've been to study? This is what I think we call a spaghetti plot, or you've spilled the spaghetti before you cooked it, at least. And here's our mean, right? Turns out the mean doesn't describe anyone. There's no one that is that. So it's some aggregate of what's going on, and you see maybe there's a negative slope here, but you've got people that are drinking more at the end of the day. So basically what I'm trying to press upon you is that mean, that aggregate, doesn't do a good job of describing kind of what's going on, even within a sample, because people are so different. Okay. So what is it about this method that can kind of elucidate certain things for us that maybe the traditional methods can't? First, few points, ambulatory assessment, it's idiographic and focus. So again, we're more interested in what's happening within a person than across all people. We collect data in real world environments, typically now through smartphones, but we'll talk about sensors and other things. These assessments are current or very recent states or behaviors. We're not asking people right now, okay, what was your last 2 weeks like? We're saying in the last 15 minutes, how angry have you been? How hostile? How sad have you been? And depending upon what we're interested in, there are different sorts of sampling techniques, if you will. Event-based assessments would be, we tell our participants, okay, whenever you've had your first drink, hit this button, fill out your first survey. Or when you've had a conflict with your partner, hit this button, something like that. Time-based would be at certain hours of the day. And so I don't use this as much. Some of my colleagues, to try to capture all that goes on in the evenings with drinking, they might have every 2 hours from 6 o'clock on do this. Random prompts, I'm a big fan of these, although they're a little more burdensome. This happens where we stratify by how many prompts per day, and then it's randomly. And the idea here is that people can't anticipate or maybe change their behavior based on if they knew they were going to get prompted like at 2 o'clock. We complete multiple assessments over time, so over several over a day and then over many days. And then these data can be self-report data, more traditional, which is called active data collection. But also we can now integrate sensor data, either sensor data in the phone, looking for my phone there, it's not there, or keystrokes, texting, or other kinds of external sensors that collect physiological data, whatever it may be. So for those reasons, I feel like this has really a lot of advantages and promise as a way to get at dynamic psychological processes. And again, I'm talking about emotional processes, cognitive styles, expectancies. Some of this should sound familiar for you addiction researchers, motivations, behavioral patterns, and also physiology as well. This real-time assessment minimizes biases. It adds this temporal dimension to the assessment. And a big thing is that I would argue much higher external validity than anything else that we typically do. Now, I'm not going to say it's not messy sometimes, right? But we're letting people live in their real life the way they want to live it and collecting data. We're not telling them what to do, kind of the opposite of what you'd like. We're not controlling for 8,000 other variables, but we're just kind of let these processes unfold as they may. Okay. So we're going to test these theories that we have, these grand theories in psychology. We can test it within individuals, again, because every day is likely to be somewhat different. We can see what things maybe are precursors to the behavior of interest, the mood state of interest, getting back to the SORC model, what triggered it, what comes after it, what reinforces it. All of these kinds of constructs, which some have pitched as more trait-like, again, are dynamic. And a lot of these are very important when you talk about substance use and addiction. Also, big surprise, contexts and environments are dynamic. It's not like we're in the same place all day around the same people. And yet sometimes by not measuring it, it's like we're playing like everything is the same every day, and it's just kind of what you do in that. Crazy. No. You can get a stream of data, which might be a combination of both active and passive data. Again, external validity. And then if I don't do a lot of this work, but there is a fairly large contingent of people, not only in the addictions area, but other areas that are now using this technique to intervene. So these are just-in-time interventions. Why is that important? Well, if there's a problem, the best time to intervene is when the problem happens. As therapists, it's like, okay, what happened this last week, Tuesday, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, what are you gonna, next time, try this, right? Here, literally, somebody can be responding on their smartphone, which suggests some sort of problem, an urge, let's say a craving for some substance they're trying to quit. There can be some kind of intervention, whether it's somebody calling them because it triggers that person, or there can be automated types of interventions where it's, let's say in DBT, have you used your DBT skills? Have you done your emotion regs? That sort of thing too. So to the extent that we can measure a process and such that we are fairly confident what's going on now may lead to some kind of problematic behavior, we can then intervene in the real world. Okay. This is, I don't know, maybe 6 hours in the life of somebody. And I'm just showing it off. I don't expect you to get anything from it, but this is skin temperature, breathing rate, measures of vigor, accelerometer, heart rate, and then also some self-report. There's mood dysregulation, there's craving, all that kind of stuff there. So why am I showing you this? Well, this is one person for 6 hours, a lot of different types of data, and we can't just look at it, figure it out, but I just want to impress upon you the types of data that we can collect, and then you can focus in on maybe physiological precursors to some event, whatever you want to do. But by collecting a variety of types of data, not just self-report, suddenly you have a much richer picture of a few hours in this person's life. Okay. So how do we use this? Well, first, we want to describe whatever the process it is, process that you're focusing on. So what is the dynamic process? Secondly, super important, often neglected, what is the time scale necessary to observe the process? So I was very interested in mood early on. Some of the earlier sampling designs were based upon descriptions of people with BPD where their moods would change sometimes within 2 hours and so forth. So I started out sampling every 2 hours, for example. So that's one way to kind of map theory onto how the design of what you're going to do. And then you have to think about context, environments, events that are also going to be relevant to the process, either trigger it or facilitate it, reinforce it. And this is a patient with BPD. This is a negative affect. Each dot is there were 6 per day, and the line is basically the average each day. So this would be an example of affective instability, right? So until I have these data, I'm more confident that this person, when they endorse that on the skid or whatever, that okay, I think you're onto something here. All right. So former student of mine who's now a professor at Notre Dame. I'm just using this as an example of describing the psychological process. Here we were interested in just a more simplified model of emotion dysregulation, which was relevant to BPD. So some basic things we considered: what is the initial state? Are there environmental triggers? What is the result of that, and what are the consequences? So just kind of breaking it down that way. Again, this is happening over time, and context is important as well. So this is borrowing from Linehan. You probably recognize it. So you're born into the world emotionally sensitive. External stimulus, something happens. Maybe it's an argument with somebody who knows. Heightened and labile negative affect. And then I'm not getting into coping styles or regulation. I'm more interested in when regulation fails. Either you're not using the right strategies or you're using wrong ones, okay? That leads to consequences, which then feeds back to emotional sensitivity. So again, this is just an example of how you might, at the very beginning, describe the process that you're interested in measuring with EMA. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few studies that all involve substance use. This was a postdoc of mine, Sungmin Yang, who's professor in South Korea now. So we were interested in affective and alcohol use and focusing on borderline personality disorder, and then our clinical control were people with depression. So both have kind of mean levels of negative affect that might or might not be similar, but yet what we were interested in is because that lability of affect, maybe that variability is going to be more strongly related to substance use than is just the overall mean level of affect. So that was the basic idea. So if you didn't know, BPD is highly comorbid with alcohol use disorders. So in a huge review, we've done a couple of these. 17 to 20% of those with AUD also meet criterion for borderline personality disorder. This is sometimes in just epi samples, not even clinical samples. And then if you flip it around, almost half of those with BPD have AUD. So this raises a couple, at least a couple of issues. One is, one theory about alcohol use disorders, it's a maladaptive attempt to regulate negative affect. But at the same time, there's also this theory, which seems to fit better with younger adults, that alcohol is a positive reinforcer. So you're trying to enhance your positive affect. Now, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but sometimes we talk about those separately. So we're going to look into this. This particular study, we didn't have smartphones way back when. Sorry. Electronic diaries, we called them. It was a fancy word for a big clunky thing you had to carry around.
Palm Pilot?
Palm Pilot was my first study. This was a step above, if you can believe that, but still not great. We sample people 6 times a day for 28 days. And then, of course, we have this hierarchical or multi-level structure in the data, which I'll try to explain a little bit better in a minute. To measure affect, we use PANAS items, positive affect, negative affect, and then because I was interested in BPD, sadness, fear, and hostility are emotions that pop, with that population. And we looked at alcohol use several different ways. One is in the moment, are they out using alcohol or not? In the moment, how many drinks have they had? And then also we could look at, is this an alcohol day versus a non-alcohol day? All the individuals in this study were women, average age, a little older. We got these people mainly through outpatient clinics. So they were in treatment. Most had a diagnosis of BPD. Those with BPD could also have major depression, but this group could not have BPD. So it's isolated for that. Most were single, divorced, or separated. And then you can see current diagnoses kind of all over the map. But the point is just that this is a clinical sample. This is not from the general population or just, student sample necessarily. In fact, 50% of these individuals had had a previous psychiatric hospitalization. Okay, so this study was not necessarily designed to look at alcohol. And so we first identified drinkers in each of these groups, and you could see a proportion of each group. They were drinkers versus non-drinkers. Those that were drinkers were decent drinkers, I guess you could say, where 10% of their drinking days were binge drinking days and about 6% for those with depression. First analysis, if we just took the mean levels each day across days for people with BPD that were drinkers versus non-drinkers, people with depression, drinkers, non-drinkers, we couldn't differentiate drinkers versus non-drinkers within each group. So whether they drank, also interestingly, that mean level didn't distinguish between those that had BPD or depression, just taking the mean. Or any interaction between these. So this first pass, it's like, okay, traditional way of just getting a mean level averaging. This doesn't provide much distinction between diagnostic groups or whether or not people are alcohol users. Okay, sidebar. I want to show you, because it's sometimes a little confusing, the difference between within day within person and between day within person. Here we have, these are just ratings of moods. I just made up, by the way. And you can see there's our mean levels, right? And so this suggests some variability within day, but every day, if you look at the mean, it's pretty similar. Now we've taken this same profile and we've divided it up. So you can see, in addition to within day variability, we have between day variability. So some of the things that you're interested in, even though it's a within person analysis, might be changing day to day. Okay. First, drinkers versus non-drinkers, affective variability within day. Again, we're sticking within diagnostic groups, drinkers, non-drinkers, BPD drinkers. Remember, the mean level didn't distinguish them. They're more variable within day in negative affect and in fear. And maybe surprisingly, maybe not, turns out depression isn't just flatline depression. People with depression also show variability. Those that were drinkers versus non-drinkers showed more within day variability, sadness, and positive affect. And then between day, so the day-to-day variability, drinkers versus non, you saw that in negative affect, fear, and sadness. And then here, I can't explain this, but we saw less day-to-day variability in drinkers versus non-drinkers in the MDD group day-to-day. So it's an interesting finding. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but it does, to me at least, reinforce this idea that to look at it at different levels, you might get different results, much like at the person level. Sometimes those relationships don't actually transpose or translate to the within person level. The classic example is, in general, long distance runners, pretty healthy, right? But if you're a long distance runner, you're more likely to have a heart attack when you're running long distance, right? That's the within person thing. So sometimes they're not the same at all. That's what also makes these different levels of analysis interesting. Same day BPD drinkers show greater within day affective variability for all of the affects. And then we look to see, is it the case that maybe alcohol might dysregulate your affect the next day? And sure enough, for BPD drinkers, if they had a drinking day, the next day they showed significantly more variability, hostility, fear, and positive affect the next day. So we think of dysregulation leading to alcohol use, but it also seems to be the case of reciprocal, that if you're using alcohol, it may dysregulate you the next day. Yeah.
So were any of these people trying to
No.
cut down or stop? Because I can imagine that might be a case too, where like, if you have one of those like small lapse days, for example.
Yeah.
The next day,
Yeah.
you might feel particularly worse about
They
it.
were not, we screened people that were trying to cut down, or if they had, the other thing we did, which made it less severe, is like if they had experienced withdrawal symptoms. But we didn't tell them anything about it. They were not trying to cut down. And they were not in treatment for alcohol use disorder. They were in treatment for depression or BPD. Okay, so summarize, mean levels of affect don't seem to help. as far as distinguishing between diagnostic groups or drinkers versus non-drinkers, but it's this within person variability in affects that does provide that distinction. And then we also saw that this can lead to, not only can lead to alcohol use, but alcohol use can lead to more instability of affect. Okay, I think that's what I said. So what does this mean? Well, and this is, I've talked to several people about this, but major theories of alcohol use disorder, it's like one of the motivations is to deal with negative affect. We don't always see it. It depends on the sample. You don't typically see it in undergrads. You may primarily see it in older folks that have a longer history of alcohol use. So certainly it could be for those with BPD, maybe a longer history of alcohol, they're using alcohol to try to tamp down or cope with negative affect. We didn't ask about motivations in this, but it's also possible that people are using to enhance whatever positive affect they have, they're trying to enhance that as well. So it doesn't necessarily rule. And again, we did not ask about motives. Okay. Another study that we did that focused on, once again, we have a sample of those with borderline personality disorder. And then this time we have community controls that drank at the same level as our people with BPD. So that was our control group. And we were very interested in getting profiles of alcohol craving. Primarily, where are you most likely to crave? What kinds of situations? And also, in what situations is it more likely that craving leads to alcohol use? Oh, this is Sean Lane, postdoc. Went away, got a job at Purdue. We got him back. He's now at Mizzou. So still work with him. But that's his postdoc picks. I'll say that's his pick right now. All right, so recruited regular drinkers. So they were drinking 2 more occasions a week. 56 people with BPD, 60 community drinkers. Here, still those clunky electronic diaries, but 21 days. So we want, again, there is a robust relationship. Probably the best predictor of drinking is craving or drinking before. Second to drinking before would be craving. It's a very robust predictor. Now, that doesn't mean every time you crave, you're going to drink, but it is very a robust association. So we, again, wanted to explore what are the environments or contexts where people seem to be craving alcohol more. Okay. Said this. Oh, in case you didn't know, if you're in church, you're probably not going to be doing some stuff that you might do outside of church. Whereas if you're a bar, so just a ridiculous example about how context can restrain you, right? Or facilitate you. There's your example. Now, we weren't asking people if they were in church, but we did ask them again about drinking craving. And let me explain this. So our red bars are people with BPD. The blue bars are community controls. Here are the contexts we looked at. School, not everyone's at school, work, bar, restaurant. Were they at home? Were they somewhere else? With their partner, with a friend, coworker, with a child, parent, other family, someone else, anybody. Okay. What's most interesting about this is where we see separation. So at school, yeah, it's about, and here we have, if you're in that context, what is the probability that your craving scores above a certain threshold? And so, not surprisingly, the highest were a bar or restaurant, and these aren't significantly different, okay? But there were some interesting differences. work, people with BPD were more likely, a higher probability of craving at work than community controls. When they were at home, same thing. When they were with their partner, wow. Big gap there. Coworker, this is a little frightening. When they're around their kids, much higher. And then kind of a few things here or there. Okay, so we've now found some interesting differences between our two diagnostic groups as far as in what context is it there a higher likelihood they're craving? What about drinking? Craving leading to drinking. For those with BPD, craving was more likely to be associated with drinking on certain days. This is our Columbia Wednesday effect, which we tried to make sense out of it, but there are a lot of drink specials and stuff in the middle of the week on college, I'm thinking certain people. So when they're with their partners or coworkers, significantly higher probability that craving leads to drinking. And at certain places when they're at work, they're not just craving, they're craving and drinking at work. So these seem to be, by looking at these contexts and then for craving and then craving leading to drinking, you could conceptualize this as very risky situations for that diagnostic group. And in fact, if you wanted to intervene when they're in that situation, you might be able to do something. We didn't do that in this study. Okay, the last study that I'll talk a little bit about is, thank goodness I'm in the 5th year of this R01 because, it may not have kept going, but I got the money in the bank and so I'm able to finish the study. We're interested in high intensity drinking in young adults. You're familiar with binge drinking. So that's 4 or 5 drinks in a 2-hour period, women versus men. High intensity drinking is like a double binge. So it's 10 to 12 drinks in a 2-hour period. So we screen people that were regular drinkers that had a history of binging and probably high intensity drinking. And this is a 1-year-long study. There are 4 EMA bursts. And then in addition, I'm not going to talk about it, we have alcohol administration. We're getting DNA, so we'll get polygenic risk scores. I'm going to predict they explain 2% of the variance. But we'll feel good, or somebody will feel good about that.
Ian.
And then, yeah, Ian is on this. Yes, how'd you know? And then, of course, we have our smartphone EMA measures. So the idea here is, again, to understand more proximal predictors of these sorts of episodes. I'm not going to show you the stuff with high intensity drinking episodes. I'm just going to, because this is literally, we just finished the analyses like Monday. So this will be more like, were they drinking in the moment and how much were they drinking? So these are Missouri residents, 21 to 29. So it's a, you might call a young adult or emerging adult sample. They have a history of binge drinking in the last 30 days. They're not being treated, not trying to cut down, et cetera, et cetera. In all, we hope to have about 400 people that go through it. And this is probably the unique part of the study. What we did is we focused on 4 major processes or supposed addictive mechanisms. And this comes from, if you've read the Cassie Bonus, I don't know if you guys have read that Psych Bulletin paper. It's a great paper for just summarizing all of the kind of core constructs, if you will, for addictions. We're focusing on 4: incentive salience, reward sensitivity, negative affectivity, and impulsivity. We have measures of each of these: questionnaire level, EMA, And also in our alcohol administration with EEG and stuff like that too, which I'm not going to talk about. And as if that wasn't enough, we give them a breathalyzer. So they blow into a breathalyzer when they're told to do so, when they're drinking at certain phases, and it doesn't tell them their BAC. Just comes directly to us. So they can't get into competitions with each other about who can blow the highest BAC. The other thing is unique, which it's so unique, I'm not going to talk about it, is context and environment, but this will be enough, I think. So here's the basic study, 12-month study, and the baseline questionnaire, the alcohol administration. Then they do an EMA burst about 2.5 months into the study. We ask their questionnaire measures after each burst and timeline follow back. And I'll go ahead and predict timeline follow back will suck and will not capture what we're capturing here. And we do this 4 times. So what does this allow you to do? We can look at within person changes within bursts and across bursts. So we can capture trajectories for some people that maybe have or on more of a heavy drinking trajectory versus others. I had to jot this down. 11% of the responses, they said they used alcohol. On average, I'm just going to focus on the first burst. People endorse drinking at least 4 days and approximately 12 drinks across the 14 days. For each day they drank, average of 3 drinks. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I realized last night I didn't have that basic stuff right now. All right. So I'm guessing you know what these things are, but in case you don't, incentive salience gets at cue reactivity and craving. So biases to alcohol cues. Reward sensitivity is you get so much reward from doing certain kinds of behaviors like drinking that this may lead to negative consequences. Negative affectivity here, we're looking at reacting with higher negative affect due to something that happens. So this might lead to negative reinforcement through alcohol use. And then impulsivity or loss of control, you're just kind of under controlled. And so maybe you drink more than you typically would or more often, and then more alcohol as well in each episode. I'm going to compare, or what's going to be in the big tables will be questionnaire measures of each of these and then EMA measures. So for a questionnaire at baseline, it's kind of traditional alcohol urge questionnaire for incentive salience, reward sensitivity. We use this measure specifically the reward sensitivity subscale, aptly named. For negative affect, we use the neuroticism subscale, and then for impulsivity, the short UPS scale. So these are the baseline measures before 2 months later, they do EMA. And this was fun to figure out how you could do it. Some of these were pretty straightforward, but some were a little tricky. Alcohol craving. Well, we just took a couple of items from that urge questionnaire. But then we also asked about alcohol cue exposure in the past 15 minutes. Are there other people in your environment? Are they drinking? And then also to detach it from social stuff, are there just cues out there? So going into your bar lab by myself, I would rate that as yes, they're everywhere, right? But there are no people. Reward sensitivity, basically, there's a pleasantness of daily life activities, and we're looking at when they rate that higher moment to moment, positive affect goes up. Kind of the opposite of negative affectivity. There's some more punishing items, and so does your negative affect kind of track that and spike when you're engaged in stuff you don't really like doing?
And then for impulsivity, we adapted for each of the subscales of the ups, our own items to measure it past 15 minutes. So everything was past 15 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to take you hopefully quickly through each of those 4 major addiction constructs. These are 3-level models. So we have modeled the momentary level. That's within day. So moment to moment. The day level. So we get the average each day and use that average to predict momentary drinking or not drinking. And then the person level is just like averaging everything, kind of like if you gave a questionnaire. Now, a lot of the reason why we do this, it's not so much that we're super interested in this, it's to isolate this. So you have to get a true momentary effect, you have to control for the day level within person effect also. And you have to control for the person level. If you just, the person level is a mismatch of all of that. It's all messed up. You can't tell what's, but this really helps us isolate that momentary effect. This chart, momentary drink number, and a lot of stars here, but you can see incentive salience in the moment was a pretty robust predictor of how many drinks they had in that moment. And you see for the day level also and person level. This kind of incremental validity, here's our baseline measure of incentive salience. It doesn't give you anything that this above and beyond this. So one might say, what's the use? You know, that this isn't telling us anything. It's not related to whether or not, how many drinks they have in a moment. And then if you're just predicting yes or no drinking, same pattern of results that you see. So that's incentive salience. Reward sensitivity, once again. Nice positive associations. Once again, our baseline measure doesn't really do much, and kind of a similar pattern on this side. This is where it gets interesting. Well, it's been interesting up until this point. I'm sure you're thinking that. Even more interesting. Negative affectivity, drinking to cope. Yeah, we talk about it all the time. Negatively related. So in this sample, and again, it could be that they're not old enough or haven't had enough of an alcohol career to be experiencing negative affect from withdrawal or whatever. In this sample, it's negatively related to how many drinks they have in the moment and negatively related to drinking in the moment. A little bit surprising.
So that suggests they might be doing other things to deal with that negative affect, or?
I haven't thought about that, or I don't know what I have where I could look and see if it relates to something else, but at least with alcohol, it doesn't seem to be a factor. And then finally, impulsivity. Not as robust findings, but we see at the day level for momentary drink number, drinking in the moment, we see it at both the momentary and day level. This is really weird. Negatively, so the upscale is negatively related to drinking in EMA. But the good news is the EMA measures of impulsivity seem to be what you would expect. And of course, this wasn't enough. Let's have a horse race. I went to school at Kentucky, horse races, right? Let's go. Well, I'm not going to show you the big model, but basically I put in all 4 of those addiction constructs at the momentary, day, and person level into the same model to see if one of these or several of these come out as the most robust predictors, adjusting for whatever the other ones could account for. At the momentary level for drinking, incentive salience, once again, negative affect negatively, and reward sensitivity. Similar pattern at the day level, and then at the person level, this drops out. So based upon this, I would say first, these core addiction constructs do seem to be able to predict drinking in the moment, whether you drink or not, or how many drinks. And then the ones that seem to be most relevant to that, when you control or adjust for the others, incentive salience, negative affect negatively, and reward sensitivity. All right, so Monday, it hasn't been that many days. There's a lot of other stuff we're gonna do. Well, we're going to calculate high intensity drinking days and binge days, and then kind of rerun these. So not just did you drink or not and how many drinks. Now, how many drinks will overlap with that a bit. We're gonna do that. We have a lot of contexts we're measuring. Alone versus with others, those are just a few of them. So we can see if those contexts moderate those momentary effects, because we have context measured in the moment as well. And then this is gonna take a while, but we got hit by COVID, so I don't have lab data on all 400. We'll have about 100. But we have behavioral tasks as they're on the ascending and descending limb, EEG stuff, and also startle for negative affect. And then there's our SPIT for DNA that will calculate polygenic risk scores and then put those in the models to see if those give you something above and beyond these core constructs. Okay, I think I'm about out of time. So why don't it's really nothing super interesting. Basically, at the very least, context, when time is a context. Drinking week in versus weekday, time of day, that stuff makes a huge difference. So you should always at least control for that, right? Also, who you're with is very important, not only just saying alone, whatever, but how close are you to that person? How many people are there? What are they doing? Are they drinking? Are they laughing at you? What are they doing? And then past history with those people. And then finally, where, not only, again, getting back to our church example, but it can constrain behavior and facilitate others. But we often don't ask about their history in that. So is it the first time you've gone to this bar? If not, what happened the last time? Did you enjoy it? Those kinds of things can make a difference. And then kind of modeling stuff, what you might see others doing and how that can also have an effect. So, yeah, I got too much stuff. But those are the players for the studies I've talked about, not the newest study, but they've been super helpful throughout all those projects. And there, 2 minutes to spare. That way you don't get many questions. Pro tip.
We have a couple moments for 1 or 2 questions if there are thoughts.
Yes.
So I'm interested in thinking about if one were to want to do the just in time intervening, where you think and sort of that chain makes sense. Is it when the urge happens, or is it when someone is engaging or in a phenomenon we know is linked to the urge? So Wednesdays, I guess, is it just?
Yeah, it could be, well, it could be both. Could be if you're in that context, maybe there's an intervention. And then as you get higher scores on craving, there's another intervention there. I mean, in general, we love to intervene as far upstream as we can, but sometimes too far upstream, it's not going to have an effect. So it probably has to be somewhat proximal. So I'd say a context or some experience of craving, something like that would be probably where I would intervene.
Is there risk of intervening too far upstream? I remember I was reading one study that was like, and then we text people when we know they're near their drug dealer. And I was like, I don't know, part of me worries that that could then actually activate the process.
Yeah, well, I would say they should have texted them before they went to go see their drug dealer.
Mhm.
So there might be another play but yes, I agree. I think, there's controversy in this area about how often you should intervene and when you should intervene. So I really think it depends on the process, the dynamic, and just your conceptualization of it. And then see, you don't want to wait, till you get to the point of no return,
Mhm, yeah.
obviously. So it's got to be before that, and where before that, I think it just depends on what it is.
Yeah, this is lovely.
I think we'll stop there and
All right.
hopefully we'll see you again in the fall for some of our speakers then.
Okay,
Thank you again.
thank you.